So welcome, Clark. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Anthony. It's great to be here. It's really nice to meet you all, and I'm delighted to have a chance to talk with you today. Let me quickly share my screen. And so hopefully you all should now see my screen, yes? Great.
Yeah.
So I want to do something a little bit different than one would normally do in a seminar talk today at Anthony's request, and try to weave together a story that tells a fair bit about the kind of work that we're doing and the kinds of questions that attract us these days here at Arizona State University, and also at the same time to use that story to help say something about the way that we're able to do this work, sitting at the interface between, on the one hand, actually it's through two separate interfaces. So on the one hand, between engineering and the social sciences. So I myself am trained many years ago as an electrical engineer, and then moved after that into research in technology policy and management, and now into what I call the human dimensions of energy transition. And so thinking about that interface between engineering and the social sciences, and how do we build collaborations across that? And at the same time, how do we build collaborations between the work that we do in universities and a variety of different kinds of actors and stakeholders out in the world? And I want to do that around this topic that over the last 5 years or so has come to mean a great deal to me in terms of trying to think about the future of our cities around the planet, where those cities are powered in some significant fraction by solar energy. So let me just tell this story, and we'll see how it goes, and then we can have a conversation about it afterwards. But it'll be a little bit different than a normal kind of seminar story, so just beware of that. Let me start with this observation. These numbers came from a study that was published earlier this year that was a revisiting of what Richard Smalley called the terawatt challenge. And Richard Smalley, of course, was a famous chemist who was central in the invention of a number of different new kinds of chemicals in Texas, in the heart of the oil industry and the petrochemical industry. And nearly a half century ago, he posed this idea that we needed to figure out, if we were to move forward in an environmentally sustainable way, how to deploy enormous amounts of solar energy. And he called this the terawatt challenge because at the time, the total energy consumption of humanity was about 15 terawatts peak, so to speak. And this study by Sarah Kurtz, who's at the University of California, Merced, asked the question, essentially, if we look forward to I'm not sure what's going on there. Sorry, y'all. Can you still hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. If you ask the question, how much energy will the world need if everyone around the world consumes energy at the level of a kind of low-end European Union average energy consumption. And then we power that world with renewable, largely renewable or other low carbon energy strategies. How much energy will we need to power the world? And in particular, if half of that energy is originally derived from the sun through photovoltaics, how much photovoltaics will we need? And the answer depends a lot on which pathway you take. If you take an all electric pathway where you electrify virtually everything in the economy and you drive it all with electric motors and direct electrification, then you end up on the very low end of this number, something like 30 terawatts of photovoltaics to provide half the energy that the world needs. On the other hand, if you take the photovoltaic energy and you convert it into, say, hydrogen, and you use a lot of hydrogen in your economy and you burn that hydrogen, or you burn synthetic renewable carbon fuels or other kinds of energy sources like that, then you end up on the high end. And of course, the reason is because all of this energy conversion is inefficient, and because thermal combustion energy sources are highly inefficient. And so you need a lot more terawatts at the other end of photovoltaics to power all of that. So Kurtz et al. Suggest that somewhere between 30 and 180 terawatts is kind of the level of total solar energy that we would need, photovoltaics energy that we would need if we wanted to power half of the world's energy supply in 2050 from photovoltaics, and we raised average world energy consumption up to a low end of a European energy consumption, which is well below, of course, American per capita energy consumption. But I think as we look out at the world and we ask these questions about how are we going to get to carbon neutrality, as a number of the world's major economies, the European Union, China, have both committed to in the last 12 months, as most of the world's major companies are now rapidly committing to this carbon neutrality by 2050 goal. How are we going to get there? Most people think that solar energy is going to have to play a huge component of that, maybe as much as 50%. And if so, we're going to need a lot of terawatts of PV panels laid out in the world, right? And so this is kind of the foundation of a whole bunch of work that we've been doing, is to try to understand what this means as we go forward. And so when we start to think about cities, there are kind of two big questions that this raises. The first of those questions is, how do we design the future of solar energy, right? Where are we going to put all of these solar panels? How many solar panels does it take to get you to 30 terawatts or 180 terawatts? The answer is a lot, tens, maybe hundreds of billions of solar panels. How big are the systems? You know, the picture that I just showed was one of the world's largest solar fields, roughly a scale of a gigawatt. But of course, we also build solar systems that are on the scale of a kilowatt. And in fact, we build solar systems in the form of solar lanterns that are at the scale of 10 watts, right? And so solar is one of these unbelievably flexible technologies that can be built in a wide range of different scales. Who owns those solar panels? The revenue stream from those 100 billion solar panels, let's just take that number, turns out to be $100 trillion over 25 years. If you take a 25-year lifetime for the solar panels, that's a lot of money. Who gets that money? Who owns the panels? And therefore, who owns those revenue streams? How are they regulated? How do we regulate the deployment of solar energy? Do we do it in a way that's beautiful? Or do we continue the tradition of the electricity sector and build giant, ugly power plants? Where do we source the materials from? What are the life cycles of all of these panels look like? How do we handle the waste? If you have 25-year lifetimes, even if you have 50-year lifetimes on photovoltaic panels, you have vast waste streams by the time you get to tens of terawatts worth of photovoltaic panels being deployed. It's a massive construction enterprise. If you're just thinking that you have to replace 1/50th of 50 terawatts, that's 1 terawatt a year worth of construction in the solar industry and 1 terawatt a year worth of waste from the solar industry, right? So how do we handle those waste streams? And is this world one in which energy is abundant, or is it one in which energy is scarce and we all are at the sort of conservation end of the spectrum, right? These are what I call design variables, meaning we could go down a variety of different pathways to the deployment of all of this solar energy. And the same is true, by the way, of whatever low carbon energy source you end up wanting to talk about in terms of getting to carbon neutrality. We just happen to do it with respect to solar, among other reasons, because the sun shines an awful lot in Arizona, and these are very real questions down here as we speak. But how do we design this future of where are we going to put all of these solar panels? What are they going to look like? What is this infrastructure? What is the organization of this infrastructure look like, right? And then the second question is kind of the flip side, which is historically, of course, we know that the cities that we have built in the 20th century are cities that were built around particular energy technologies. We built them around the automobile and gasoline, and we built them around the centralized electricity grid. And all kinds of different facets of our urban infrastructure and urban lives as we live them, the ways that we live, the ways that we work, the ways that we play, are organized around 20th century, early 20th century technological energy infrastructures, right? And so energy design has enormous implications for urban design. And so the second question is then, as we move forward and we rebuild the energy infrastructure of the world in new ways, are we also going to rebuild cities in new ways as well, right? What is the design of the future cities that we will create in and around the future of low carbon energy sources like solar energy? And the reason I wanted to start with these kind of very big picture questions is because when I think about the kinds of transdisciplinary research enterprises that we've been able to pursue at ASU, and I don't want to get stuck in language debates about what's interdisciplinary, what's transdisciplinary, et cetera. But so, what I mean by that is research enterprises that cut across multiple parts of the university and that link the university to multiple different kinds of other actors in the world, businesses, cities, NGOs, communities, et cetera, right? When I think about the kinds of research enterprises that we've built that are able to do that, it all starts with being able to ask questions at this very high systems level. Because you have to be able to do that in order to open up space within the research enterprise for people who are asking very different kinds of questions, and to do it in a way that attracts them, right? That allows them to ask questions that they find particularly compelling, thinking about it from their disciplinary perspective or from their institutional perspective, if they're an institution outside of the university. And so we have found that you just have to push yourself at the beginning up to these very high systems level kinds of questions. Like, how are we going to deploy 30 terawatts of photovoltaics in the world, right? That has all kinds of engineering dimensions to it. And we can ask all kinds of really interesting engineering questions about it, but we can also ask questions about culture. We can ask questions about art. We can ask questions about sociology and anthropology and justice when we ask questions at that very, very high level. So, oh, sorry, I actually had that on this next slide. right? We get to ask a variety of different kinds of questions. We also are able to flange up with the interests of lots of different kinds of entities. I can tell you there's all kinds of companies and all kinds of NGOs and all kinds of communities and all kinds of metropolitan governments in the world that care a lot about the question, where and how are we going to put all these solar panels down in the world, physically, socially, economically, politically, right? There are just lots of ways to take that agenda and make it line up with other organizations' kinds of agendas. And then the third point that I'll make is that when you're thinking about things in terms of these very big picture, kind of high level systems agendas, what that allows is for individual projects, even if they're quite disconnected at the beginning, to evolve in ways over time that allow you to make the connections, right? It's actually quite difficult to sit down at the beginning of a project and have a group of electrical engineers who work on photovoltaic semiconductor physics and a group of anthropologists who are interested in questions of social justice in minority communities in cities, and have them be able to create a collaborative research agenda. It's very difficult to do at the outset, but you can evolve those collaborative research projects over time if you allow for these spaces within which people's ideas can evolve, and then you make sure that they're communicating and engaging in rich ways as part of the process. So what I want to do in the rest of the talk is to illustrate how we've done this in the context of one research center that I helped to lead, the Quantum Energy and Sustainable Solar Technologies Engineering Research Center. This is an NSF and DOE collaboratively funded research center. It's been running about 10 years. And I'll tell you a little bit about how it started, but it focuses on photovoltaic technologies, as an engineering research center inevitably has to do, that focus on that core technology innovation agenda. And how we've built this larger, more collaborative, more interdisciplinary research agenda around solar cities within the context of Quest. So when we started in two very different places. My colleagues in electrical engineering were very focused on this question of the terawatt challenge. And they had a particular focus on it, which was how do we innovate PV technologies so that we can increase their efficiency, right? We can increase the efficiency of the solar cell from, I know they were at 11 or 12% on average in the marketplace in 2010. Today they're at 21%, right? So that doubling of the efficiency has made a huge difference. At the same time, how can we reduce the cost of the panel by using fewer materials, by using cheaper materials, by doing other kinds of things that improve the manufacturing efficiency, right? And if you can simultaneously increase the efficiency of the panel and decrease the cost, you get the kind of solar revolution that we've seen in the last 10 years, in which solar goes from being quite expensive as a technology to now being the cheapest source of electrons on the planet, right? And so that was the focus of my colleagues, who were, for the most part, electrical engineers, material scientists, physicists, and others who were focused on the details of semiconductor cell manufacturing, right? How do you make these individual PV cells? On the other hand, I was interested in a very different set of problems. For me, energy systems are not simply technologies, right? This is one of my favorite diagrams or pictures. It's from a children's book, Richard Scarry's children's book, What Do People Do All Day, from the 1950s. And you know what his illustrations do so well is they remind us that people are everywhere in technological systems, and what they do is spend a lot of their time making technological systems work, right? And so this page is, of course, the coal-fired power plant. There's the guy who's working the boiler. The page before is the coal mine, and the miners who are putting the coal in the train drives it over here, somebody shovels it into the elevator so that it goes up and goes down into the power plant. And of course, the electricity that comes out then comes to your home, where you have people vacuuming, you have people watching television. And my favorite of all is the little pig sitting up on top of the coal-fired power plant, reading a book about Ohm's law, because of course he represents the student, the electrical engineering student. And of course, it's a reminder that in order to create this system, we had to invent the discipline of electrical engineering. We had to transform higher education in order to bring the world of electricity into being. We had to bring into being a whole new social formation, right? A whole new academic discipline. We also brought into being new kinds of social activities, new forms of communication like television. Many people don't remember, but General Electric, which invented the electricity grid, also invented the television because they could sell the electricity, because they could sell the equipment to the television station, because they could sell the equipment to you in the house, the TV to watch the thing. And of course, everybody needed electricity to make all this equipment run. So it was great for General Electric to have these new technologies, right? But the point is that energy systems are actually worlds in which we all live. And as we transform energy systems, we also transform our lives in very dynamic ways. And so I was interested in this question: as we go forward, how will energy transitions transform how people live, work, and play in the future? Out of that began to come a series of projects. And I just want to walk you through these projects and kind of describe how this evolution happened. And so the first thing that I began to ask was, well, let's take this terawatt challenge seriously, that you guys are claiming we're going to deploy a lot of solar energy. What happens if we actually deploy a lot of solar energy? What will all of those solar panels mean for society? And I was collaborating on the right-hand side of this diagram with some folks in sustainable engineering and the built environment, which is our version of civil engineering, blown up in some interesting ways. And they were interested in doing recycling technology, recycling development. They were interested in doing environmental life cycle analysis. And so we began to build some collaborations around what would the future of the LCA for a photovoltaics industry look like, and how could we design a photovoltaics industry that would minimize different kinds of aspects of the life cycle impacts of photovoltaics. In order to do that, we had to invent some new techniques for LCA, because LCA is a very, it depends a lot on knowing how the process actually works. But we, of course, were talking about the future. And so we didn't know exactly how the future would work. So we had to invent a future-oriented methodologies for LCA. Likewise, we got involved with some folks who were doing architectural competitions called the Land Art Generator Initiative. Really amazing group of people. And they were interested in how do we deploy renewable energy as public art? And they were running global competitions. They've run them now for over a decade in different cities around the world on designing major public art installations that also generate renewable energy. In other words, how do we replace those ugly natural gas and coal-fired power plants with unbelievably beautiful parks that are also generating energy? And what was interesting was we were then able to take these different trajectories of research that we were interested in from the standpoint of the human dimensions of energy transitions and the environmental dimensions of them, and turn them back into questions that the electrical engineers could answer. Like, how do material recycling requirements impact the optimal design of PV cells and panels? It turns out they're actually in quite tension with one another, because what you really want to build is a solar cell that sits out in the rain and the sun and the wind and the snow and the ice for 25 years and just keeps producing electricity. And it turns out if you do that, it's really hard to recycle. And so there's some really interesting materials physics questions in that tension. Likewise, from the art perspective, could we design solar cells that actually worked differently for different kinds of applications? Solar cells have become a commodity enterprise, but could you actually do better if you designed solar cells differently for different kinds of applications? So we also began asking some other questions. So we began asking questions like political economy. I mentioned earlier, who will own all of these solar panels and the revenue that they generate? Will that impact the distribution of global wealth? Fossil fuel-based energy systems have been some of the greatest concentrators of wealth in the history of the economy, the global economy. Will solar replicate that experience, or will it take a different path? Turns out it's not, you can't predict it. You actually have to design it one way or the other. And similarly, we began asking questions that our anthropologist colleagues were very interested in around questions of racial justice and decolonization. How have energy systems contributed to injustice, contributed to inequality, and could we do better if we thought seriously about the design of future energy systems? Related to that question, we began asking questions about designing solar energy to create what we called the social value. And here we began to ask some interesting questions that historically have not been asked about, especially energy access projects. So projects in remote and rural areas of the world that don't currently have electricity. Those are mostly designed in terms of delivering energy, but they actually rarely ask the kind of more user-centered question, which is how will people actually use the energy in ways that would create value in their local community, in their local economy. And we've been able to do a bunch of innovative new collaborations through these projects with small solar companies in Nepal and the Philippines, Bolivia, and Uganda, where we are doing capacity building with those companies and helping them understand and learn how to design projects better, not as engineers, because we're not engineers, but as in terms of their ability to deliver projects that are user-centered and that deliver value to their customers. Similarly, we've begun to work in Sierra Leone with the national government, the energy ministry, and a number of their electric utilities to try to help them improve the bankability of their rural electrification projects. And we've been able to work with low-income communities here in the United States, in particular in Puerto Rico, to try to find ways to deploy solar energy so that we enhance community resilience and we enhance economic security within those communities. And so that's been an enormous amount of fun to do, and it's gotten us new outside collaborations that have allowed us to really do some social impact work that's been quite valuable. In a very different direction, we started to work with some folks on campus who do futuring. There's a whole industry out there that works with companies to imagine scenarios of what the future might look like, to supplement predictive modeling efforts with other kinds of methodologies that allow you to think about the future. And we were able to work with a group called Arizona Town Hall, which annually does a dialogue with about 150 to 200 state leaders around a topic of importance to the state. They decided in 2011 to do Arizona's energy future as their topic. And so we had an opportunity to sit down with business leaders, policy leaders, and civic leaders from around the state for 3 days and have a conversation about Arizona's energy future. That involved a lot of conversations about solar energy and the role that it might play. And then the next year, we were able to, in partnership with an organization called Emerge, which does art science collaboration, we were able to do a scenario process where we looked explicitly at different pathways that a solar energy future might take in the state of Arizona. And you see the 4 scenarios that we developed down at the bottom. There's a publication that's associated with this that I'd be happy to share the reference to. And all of this stuff, all of these early projects, at any rate, there are publications now that I'm happy to share that came out of these. And this really began to give us insights into this question and really pushed this question on our agenda of how might the future of society and culture evolve as we evolved different kinds of energy futures, because the worlds that people imagined around these different scenarios were really quite radically different for the future of Arizona. Just to give you an example, in the leftmost scenario, desert power, this was affectionately known as Saudi Arizona. And the idea was that Arizona would create a petrochemical industry of the future in which we deploy enormous numbers of solar panels in the Arizona desert. And we use those to derive, at the time, we were talking about recyclable carbon synthetic fuels. I suspect now we would probably spend more time talking about hydrogen. But the idea was we would generate a large fraction of the United States's fuel supply, which we would then, send out through pipelines to the rest of the country to provide renewable, low carbon fuel supplies, right? And that's just radically different than the scenario that emerged in the green Silicon Valley scenario, in which what emerged instead was something more like a Silicon Valley-like startup culture in Phoenix, focused on solar innovation and focused on different kinds of small scale, radically distinctive and entrepreneurial kinds of business opportunities, research opportunities, and so forth around solar energy, right? And it gave you a feel that solar could take many different forms, and those different forms would create different kinds of economies, and those different kinds of economies would mean different kinds of workforces, and therefore would mean different kinds of job opportunities, different kinds of communities that could be supported by those different kinds of economies. And so we took that idea and we said, well, okay, that's interesting, but what would it actually be like to try to live in some of those different futures, right? As opposed to thinking about them in terms of, lots of solar panels out in the desert producing a chemical industry or a fuels industry out of those photovoltaics, and then piping that out to the world. So that's an infrastructure vision of that future. But what is it like to actually live in that future? And so we collaborated with a group at ASU called the Center for Science and the Imagination, which is a group of English and art majors and faculty and design faculty who have built a network of science fiction authors that they work with to create imaginative visions of the future. And we held a workshop in 2018 where we brought together photovoltaics, electrical engineers, material scientists, life cycle analysts, civil engineers, science fiction authors, artists, social scientists, in a 2-day workshop. And we did what we called a narrative hackathon. We broke into 4 teams, and each team had a science fiction author, and each team built a world, a future world powered by solar energy, and then they wrote a story in that world. And then after the workshop, well, they storyboarded a story, and then after the workshop, the author went off and wrote the story. And meanwhile, the other participants in the working group went off and wrote essays about the experience, about the world, about the assumptions underlying the world, about the technologies that powered the world. And we collected all of this stuff in a book called The Weight of Light, and it's free to download. And so you can all go download it. Again, happy to share the link to that, but it's easy to find if you Google The Weight of Light and ASU. And then we were so excited about the result of that, that earlier this year, right before the pandemic broke out, we took another trip up to the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and we sat down with the folks at the Center for Integrated Mobility Studies there, who study electric vehicles and car ride sharing and other kinds of future transportation technologies. And we did the same thing again, except this time we did it about the future of cities. And so sometime in the next couple of months, Cities of Light will come out. It's almost done. And it's a second set of stories and accompanying essays. This time they're actually about cities. And so the 4 cities that we wrote about, you can see at the bottom: San Antonio, Portland, Chicago, and San Juan. And what we've learned a lot of things through these collaborations, but we've particularly learned that it really does matter how you integrate solar into people's lives in terms of what it'll be like to live in that future world. And so our now argument coming out of this is we should actually be paying a fair bit of attention as we deploy a lot of solar to how we're deploying that solar. And I'm about to have this conversation with one of the biggest utilities here in Phoenix. We've got 3 big utilities in Arizona, 2 here in Phoenix. And the head of R&D for one of those has been going around basically saying, look, in the next decade, we're going to have to put somewhere between 5 and 10 gigawatts of solar into Arizona just for us. And the other 2 utilities are going to have to put a similar amount in. And that's just between now and 2030, right? And if you get to carbon neutrality by 2050, they're probably going to have to put in twice that much. And so I want to have this conversation. Okay, how do we actually think about how we deploy this energy in the context of a city like Phoenix, so that we get the kind of futures that we want to live in, and not just a future in which we have a whole bunch of solar panels sitting out in the desert sending electrons into the city, because that's only one possible vision of what this might look like. We then took these ideas about futures thinking and creativity and art and aesthetics, and we started working with youth, both in Phoenix. The group on the right is a group of Hispanic youth from a low-income community on the west side of Phoenix, who have gotten very excited about the prospect of building community solar so that it creates value for their neighborhood. And then the picture on the left comes out of a summer program that the University of New Mexico, which is one of our partners in Quest, did this past summer with the Land Art Generator team, looking at how you could apply these ideas of aesthetically beautiful renewable energy in the context of the future of New Mexico's landscapes. So this has enabled us to do some really imaginative and innovative educational work as well, and educational outreach. around youth activism. Um, we've also gotten much more serious about our futures-oriented work. So we're working with one of the big utilities here in Arizona to ask the question, how do we actually get to carbon neutrality? They've set a carbon neutrality target for 2050, and they're now quite seriously engaged in the question, what does it actually mean for an electric utility to try to get to carbon neutrality? And they've asked us to work with them to build scenarios of the final 20% of that problem. They think the first 80% is easy. I mean, not easy in the sense of there's not a lot of work to do, but in the sense of we kind of know what we have to do to get there. But the last 20% they think is not nearly so obvious. And so we've been working with them to create some different scenarios, which we're now gonna work to build a dialogue with a wide variety of stakeholders around their service territory to explore the question of to what extent do these pathways reflect futures that people think are exciting, good opportunities for the city, and so forth. So it's going to be a really interesting dialogue, but it's the first time in the context of Arizona that anybody has really asked this kind of high level question of, there are different pathways to trying to get to carbon neutrality. Which of these futures do we really want to see for Arizona? And of course, what we imagine is likely to happen is that the future is a mix of these different technologies, but what mix and how mix and why mix are, we think, where all of the important questions lie. And so this is the start of what we imagine will be probably a multi-decades long conversation about how we get to a different place in terms of Arizona's energy future. To bring it back to engineering, out of a bunch of these different projects, we've been talking with our engineering colleagues, and we've now developed a vision around the idea that we might be able to design multifunctional PV systems. So PV systems right now are built basically to provide electrons. But it turns out you could probably do a whole bunch of other stuff with those PV technologies in order to create different kinds of functionality. So for example, one of the things my colleagues are very interested in is light filtering. How can you filter the light that comes out the bottom of the solar panel so that instead of just shading what's underneath it, you perhaps optimize the light spectrum that comes out underneath. And maybe you can use this then to drive plant growth. And maybe you can optimize differently for different kinds of plant systems. And so you can avoid stressing the plants with light spectrum that they don't need, and you can optimize the spectrum that they do need for growth, right? So that's one option. Another place where we're interested is, can we address urban heat island? So right now, solar panels in Phoenix are all black. Black is not a good color if you're trying to address the urban heat island effect. So could you do a better job of reflecting some of the spectrum that you don't transform into electricity back into the atmosphere? Could you actually use solar panels to create cooling, right? Are there strategies for actually cooling the atmosphere around the solar panel? Are there ways of doing other kinds of heat management so that you don't get the kind of overheating that drives the efficiency of solar panels down when the temperature is really high, right? And so a lot of interesting questions about how we might be able to use that, and especially in trying to address the resilience of communities as we confront the fact here in Phoenix that the temperatures continue to climb because of climate change. And so another interesting question, right? So we're beginning to explore this question now, but it's a much more integrated exploration now, where we're interested in social value, we're interested in business models, and we're interested in new technologies all at the same time. And in a way that's really exciting to me because we might be able to address some real social justice problems. And at the same time is super exciting to my electrical engineering colleagues because we might be able to do some really interesting new physics on the semiconductors, right? So this is the kind of evolution of a collaborative agenda that can happen even if we start in very different kinds of places. And that then leads me to the last slide here, which is a project that we're just beginning now. It encompasses much of what you've seen already. And it is really this question about what does a solar city look like? And how should we be approaching that as a governance problem? You know, historically, utilities have designed the future of the electricity grid largely by themselves, perhaps with a regulator. But as they move out into the world of electrifying buildings and electrifying transportation, it really is no longer the case that they can imagine what these futures are going to look like and plan for them all by themselves. So we really have to think about multi-sectoral governance of the energy transition. So how does that happen in an urban context? What are the questions of social justice that are embedded in that question of who gets to own, for example, the future of solar panels? Who benefits from the design and development of future solar systems? You know, acknowledging, right, that building a new gigawatt scale solar field out in on, you know, marginal farmland or desert land where you can grade it all flat and you can build it all with an automated construction process, right? You get much cheaper solar energy if you do that. But there's a whole lot of co-benefits that you could potentially achieve by building it at $3 a watt inside the city instead of $1 a watt outside the city. How do we create the kind of financial mechanisms that hold utility ratepayers harmless, but nonetheless get that solar invested inside the urban boundaries, doing innovative and creative things rather than just putting it out there where there's nominally some sort of an empty space, where in fact many of the rural inhabitants have historically shown they're not all that excited about having new energy infrastructures built in their rural landscapes to power somebody else's factories. So with that, let me just say thank you for listening to this random walk through the last 10 years of our research here at ASU around solar energy and cities, and open it up for a conversation.
Thank you so much, Clark. So two options. People who want to ask the question can either write it in the chat window or use the little raise your hand symbol, and then we will unmute you and let you ask your question. And then I see Jill has raised her hand.
Just a comment. I'm wondering, actually it's a question. I'm wondering where we get, when you talk about the rural inhabitants are not so happy about the solar farms that are popping up near them. We are having that problem in Oregon where the farmers are objecting to the brush being cleared because then the brush dwellers like the elk and the deer and the jackrabbits and the ground squirrels are invading their farms because their natural habitat is being cleared. So I'm wondering, are solar cities a way of keeping the solar farms out of the rural areas? I mean, we don't have to, we wouldn't have to deforest and de-jungle if we build solar cities. Do the solar cities contain the the voltaic capture mechanisms so that we don't have to have rural and desert thousands of acres of land plots for solar farms?
Yeah, so this is very much the kind of question that we're trying to encourage people to ask. And it depends a lot on the city, its geography, what you're trying to accomplish, how much solar energy you need for that city, and so forth. And it also depends a little bit on what you're willing to imagine in terms of what the future of the city might look like. So, so for example, we just recently collaborated with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory to do a study of Puerto Rico, which mirrored a study that they had already done for the rest of the United States, which was to ask how much solar technical potential is there on the rooftops of low-income housing across the United States. And so we did that for Puerto Rico, and the numbers came back surprising to all of us. But the short answer is all residential buildings, if you put solar on the rooftops of all residential buildings in Puerto Rico, it would power the entire electricity needs of the island for all uses, right? So the gigawatt hours are there, right? In fact, the terawatt hours are there in terms of being able to supply the electricity. Now, it turns out Puerto Rico is also a very solar friendly place in the sense that their electricity demands are quite low, and they don't have the kind of huge evening spikes that a lot of other places have. So you wouldn't need as much batteries. And since it's tropical, the sun shines all year round, and the electricity load doesn't vary very much, and there isn't much air conditioning load, and there isn't much heating load. And so it really is a kind of an ideal place for trying this kind of experiment. And then it turns out macroeconomically, it would be fantastic, because right now they spend $8 million a day, $3 billion a year to import carbon and set it on fire. And so from a macroeconomic standpoint, if you reverse that and you build locally sourced, locally owned energy, you have a huge economic kind of driver that you could do there. So in a case like that, it works in a really compelling way. A totally different model would be to think about Phoenix. We actually love shade here in Phoenix because the desert sun is ridiculously overpowering. And so I just did the calculation one time. What would happen if you put a 50% shade structure, right? So panel, open space, panel, open space, panel, open space over the entire city of Phoenix? Well, the answer is you could power the western third of the United States, right? So the areas required are not enormous, and you can do a lot with the city. But, when you start to do that, you really have to think about putting it over streets, putting it over open spaces, putting it over parking garages, putting it on all the commercial and residential rooftops, right? In order to really grow the power levels, you got to put it in a lot of places. In a place like Phoenix, that makes perfect sense. I mean, of course, we wouldn't build a shade structure over the whole city, as interesting as that is. And by the way, that's in one of our science fiction stories, that kind of a shade structure. But just as a teaser to get you to go download it and read it. But you can do a lot here where you could get a lot of benefit from some innovative applications of solar. Actually, there's a company in the Bronx that's interested in moving into the Arizona market, that's been doing some very interesting things in terms of building rooftop shade structures in New York to help people create nicer spaces on their rooftops for outdoor living in New York. And I think, bringing some of their creative talent to bear in thinking about a very different urban environment like Phoenix. I'm hoping they'll come, and I'm hoping that we can do some collaborations with them in some creative ways. So it really depends a lot on how much of the power you need to be in solar, and it really is going to depend on, can we find some ways that financially we can make this work, because it really does cost more to build the same number of gigawatts or megawatts in an urban context versus building it out in a rural context. It's harder to control. You have smaller systems, so you have more inverters. Now, there's some really interesting work going on at DOE about what does the future of the grid look like with all of these small scale, all of these many scaled storage and renewable energy systems on it, all within smart inverters, and all of those smart inverters talking to each other, right? That's a really interesting electrical engineering problem. I know nothing about it, but there's DOE is funding some very interesting work on trying to think about what that looks like.
Okay, we have a question from Chip.
Yep. Hey, thank you. Appreciate your talk. Thank you, Dr. Miller, for presenting. It's very interesting, and I'll look up your books there. Those would be quite interesting. Myself, I used to live down in Houston, which has got a lot of sun, and I had actually put money down for one of the Tesla solar tile roofs because they looked, aesthetically attractive. We waited a whole year. They couldn't provide anything until we eventually, in fact, we waited for like 2 or 3 years, and we eventually bailed on it. We didn't do it. But I would have been willing to spend the $100,000 it would take just to make a single residence, covered in that stuff. They would have also installed 3 of the solar, the power walls, that's their terminology. And then you could charge up your electric vehicle and all this kind of stuff. And my son lives in Boston, and he returns the electricity to the grid, which is what your inverters things talks about. So what do you think about those Tesla solar tiles?
Well, I'm waiting to see one.
They had them on a demo house. I don't know.
I know they did. So this is another area where my work with my PV engineering colleagues has been, to me, more frustrating than I would like, because I've thought for the full 10 years of the collaboration that there's some really interesting opportunities available in terms of building integrated photovoltaics in creative and innovative ways like Tesla has proposed. Now, they tell me it's really, really hard to get the physics right of those technologies, and that's why Tesla's having so much trouble. And similarly, GE had a project where they were gonna put solar cells inside of roof tiles, and that project collapsed. So it's just, from a kind of a physics and a business model standpoint, it's a really, really hard. That particular problem is a really, really hard problem. But I think there's just all kinds of opportunities. I mean, just think about, what if you embedded programmable LEDs into your rooftop solar panels, so you didn't have to climb up on your roof to put your Christmas lights up every year, right? I mean, isn't that a sales point for getting a solar system? I know people who might actually just buy it so they didn't have to climb up on their roof to light their roof up every year. So, I think we can be very creative as we go forward, particularly as the industry evolves from this kind of commodity industry that it's become, where the push really was to generate the cheapest, most replicable solar panel on the planet, because you had to get it down to the point where solar was competitive with other energy producing technologies. But now that it's there, and in fact below there, there's lots of room now in the pricing possibilities for doing other creative things. So I think we'll see more like that, and I think that it will really help the industry. Again, find ways to do this better in cities. I mean, if you're already up on a roof, replacing a roof, being able to replace that roof with a solar powered set of tiles, then the cost for the installation is zero because you were already putting in the roof. And so that's a huge upside. And by the way, you don't have to build the rack, so you don't have to buy the rack either, right? So your balance of system costs come down dramatically if you can do that kind of innovation.
Right, and then one follow-on comment is that photovoltaics are all well and good. The technology keeps evolving and getting better. But back in the early mid 80s, we had a house in California which had a simple semi-cylinder reflector for a big water heater.
Yep.
And we didn't have gas, which was our heating system, for 3 days, and we never noticed it. We had plenty of shower water and everything. You don't have to go electricity. You can just heat water direct.
I have a 360-degree panoramic image from the roof of the house that I stayed in Puerto Rico 2 summers ago. And every rooftop has a solar water heater on it, right? It's a very simple technology down there. Yeah, the Israelis and the Palestinians have deployed massive numbers of solar water heaters. It just hasn't caught on in the United States in the same kind of way. But solar thermal technologies are also super interesting for a variety of applications. There's some interesting work being done on solar furnaces, which might be able to generate industrial heat for process heat in manufacturing. So lots of innovation, I think, ahead of us in these different spaces. Yeah, thanks for that comment.
We have one question, the chat box. Daniel asked, when I think solar, I immediately think night. Only solution appears to be batteries, but they are very inefficient. What is the solution? Anything besides batteries?
Yeah, so this is super interesting because it's the obvious problem with solar energy, and of course they're inefficient. Batteries are inefficient, and the conversion is inefficient. Although they're much more efficient than fuels. And so an electric car, a photovoltaic powered electric car is much more efficient than other ways of getting the energy into a vehicle. So I actually think as we look at, we're already having problems, you may be too, with the California energy imbalance market. There's so much solar in California already that in significant portions of the year now, between the hours of 10 a.m. and 2 p.m., electricity prices on the California energy imbalance market are negative. They cannot give away the electrons. They have to pay people to take electrons off the grid. And so our regulators have told our utilities that they must take these negatively priced electrons when they're available. And it's just this huge supply. And so smart charging of our vehicles, in which we charge vehicles in the middle of the day, is going to become a huge piece of this puzzle because we have to sink these massive numbers of electrons. And then, of course, it makes no sense just to have those electrons sit around in those batteries until somebody decides to use them. You ought to then be taking them back out of those batteries and using them on the grid to do evening charging. It turns out probably evening is the biggest problem, not night. LED street lighting is already reducing nighttime electricity demand so fast that many utilities are actually having problems balancing their load because their base load systems can't drop low enough in terms of production to deal with how far their demand is falling in the middle of the night because of LED street lighting. So I think we're also going to see load shifting. Very interesting discussions here about freezing water in the middle of the day and using that to as the basis of cooling and heat pumps, so that you can do air conditioning with ice and you can shift that demand. Then all you got to do is have a fan that blows the air in the night. Much lower energy consumption than running your HVAC system. So I think we're going to see load shifting. I think we're going to see real-time pricing of electricity, certainly in industry, maybe also in the residential space, with smart energy systems that allow for demand management of all kinds to happen. It'll be interesting to see, to come back to questions I care about, who owns that. There's a huge fight between the appliance manufacturers, Google and Apple, that own the smartphones. The AT&T wants to get involved, and T-Mobile, because they own the wireless and Wi-Fi systems that communicate. The utilities, of course, don't want to have to pay anybody to do the smart demand. They would rather control the smart demand themselves. So there's this huge fight about to happen. It's already happening over the standards, the IEEE standards for smart devices, so that you can do this load control, and who's going to be able to control and own essentially that demand management function within the future of the electricity system. So all kinds of things are going to happen at night on the technology side. And then there's a question of what happens on the culture side. And I'm very intrigued by this, as are a number of my students that I work with, and particularly one student who's a science fiction writer and writes in the solar punk genre. And he and I have done a little kind of riff on some of the different cultural ways in which different kinds of communities might evolve in different kinds of directions. So in the new book, the Cities of Light book, the city of San Antonio actually becomes a deliberately dark community. And for them, it's all about, there are various things that happen at night. And you can actually go out and on the internet and look at what's called dark sky communities. There's a network of communities around the world that are already saying there's too much light at night. We want to be able to reclaim the beauty of the Milky Way, essentially, and be able to be a dark sky community. And so the whole idea of actually shutting down your society at night so that people can rest and relax and sleep is culturally very attractive to many people who are at the moment caught up in a 24/7, 365 rat race. I too see the beauty of a culture that isn't quite so committed to being able to use energy whenever it wants. So I think it's a really interesting question about what the future is going to look like. And I suspect it's much more diverse than our current approaches, where I think we're going to see lots of different ways of coping with what essentially is a market function, right? Electricity is going to be really expensive. If in fact half the energy is produced from solar, electricity at night is going to be really expensive. It's just going to be like peak electricity at the moment. You know, peak electricity on my grid at the moment is 35 cents a kilowatt hour. Nighttime electricity, where there's really low demand, is 7 cents a kilowatt hour. We're just going to see that flip. It's going to be, 1 cent a kilowatt hour at noon, and it's going to be 50 cents a kilowatt hour at night. And we're just going to adjust, but we're going to adjust in some different and really interesting ways.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miller. I think we're at time. So Dr. Yitter, if you have any closing remarks, I'm gonna.
No, I mean, no particular closing remarks. I think this is a super fascinating perspective on what could happen in the future. And I think in many ways, it was a engineering and technology management in a nutshell. So I think this whole idea of, well, we need to look into how do people respond, what different trajectories into the futures exist. How does this work on the system level and not just on the device level, however cool those devices are for us as engineers. I think this was super illustrative. So I could not have asked for a better kickoff of this term. Thank you very much, Clark. Thank you so much.
Oh, you bet. Delighted to be here. It's always fun to talk about this stuff with folks, and you've been a great audience. Those were great questions. And hopefully we'll have more opportunity to have conversations in the future.
Very
So thank you.
Thank you. Happy weekend.
Yes, take care, everybody.